as an educator, this is something I probably learned way too late in my teaching career.
Every time we are listening to information or we're reading information, our brain is simultaneously painting a picture.
How many of you remember the questions in the math of like, Barry has 14 watermelons?
I imagined a stack in a fruit shop. What did you imagine?
I imagined them in a trolley.
What did you imagine?
I imagined him balancing them all in his arms on top of each other and trying to carry them.
There we go.
Yeah.
We're all picturing it
Yeah.
because we have to picture it to comprehend it.
What can I do to level up my teaching, or what's one thing I can add in to make it also more fun for me?
Yes.
Add in a story. Challenge yourself. Like, where can you build some stories into what can otherwise be really dry curriculum?
Podclass acknowledges the true and traditional custodians of the land we meet on here today. We are meeting in Naarm and pay our respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.
So no one told you teaching was gonna be this way. Your lesson plans are jokes, your patience broke, you're feeling in disarray. It's like you're always stuck in report writing, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your school year. But I'll be here for you.
When the students start to riot,
I'll be here for you.
even if your coffee's gone cold,
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Podclass. As always, you are joined by Wil Massara, CEO and founder of
Hola.
Youth Leadership Academy Australia, alongside Skye Hughes.
Hello.
And myself, who are CEOs and founders of Youth Engagement Project. And today we are here to chat all about the one with storytelling.
Storytelling, we know it's powerful. We're going to delve into a little bit about why that is throughout this episode and how we can use it in our classrooms, in our teachings, in life to kind of level up ourselves, our conversations, our connections. But I feel like it would be really dumb to start an episode about storytelling. Just putting it out
say it
there.
how it is, Skye.
And that's what I'm known for. To start an episode about storytelling without actually telling a story. And I know, Amanda, we were chatting like off air before we started, and I feel like, you know, that story that you were sharing would be a really good one potentially to start with.
That story about a moment when I realised the power of stories.
Yes, that one.
We love that moment.
We love it.
Some of our listeners may be aware that I have spent a long time blessed and privileged to live in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. And whilst living there, I had the opportunity to go on this walk, this hike that was led by traditional owners and senior cultural leaders. And at that time, when I was invited on this hike, it hadn't been done for more than 70 years. And the path we were about to trek was a path from the home community where we were living at the time to an outstation. And that path was across escarpments, across rock country, littered with rock art and traditional bush fruits. And the whole way I've never felt so, in my life, I've never felt so much like I have no knowledge here. Like I was completely immersed in culture and country and kinship, and every step of the way I learnt something, you know, whether it was this strand of grassy fronds in front of us, learning how to pull them and then strip them and then weave them in a way to make string, and then taking that grass and that string and finding the right piece of stick and using that grass to attach a rock to make a spear, and then getting to our campsite and the young yowding, the young men using that spear to catch fish, and taking that fish and collecting bush herbs off the mountains to cook that fish with traditional bush herbs in fire. And the whole days as we were on this hike, I was continuously at that moment of knowing how little I know, if that makes sense, and being like this peephole into this whole other world of knowledge. And I remember one night we found ourselves laying under the stars with a fire going next to us, crackling away. We can feel the warmth from it. And we were laid out, myself as the teacher, It's so funny to say that. The teacher, I was teaching nothing, I can assure you. I was learning every step of the way with my class of Year 10 students. And we were looking at the stars, and we were listening to the voice of the traditional owner, the senior traditional owner of that exact country where we're on top of that escarpment, as he told us stories of the stars and how they guide us and how they teach us our morals and how they're our compass for how we move forward in this world. And at that exact moment, I thought to myself, storytelling is truly everything. And I found myself immersed in this capsule of Indigenous culture. You know, those stories he was sharing with us, some bits in English, some in Gunwingu, but I was, listening carefully and following along. They're the stories that have been passed down for generations, and I'm sitting inside this planet's oldest living culture, inside the stories that have been passed down for so many generations. And it's those moments where you go, storytelling is power for a reason. It lives on. It lives on. You remember how they make you feel. You remember the morals. And I think it's important to acknowledge the power of storytelling in learning and in teaching and in uncovering more about who we are.
And it's interesting, and I love that, and I get goosebumps like hearing you share like all of your experiences of living up in the NT and living in Arnhem Land, and it's something that I've never experienced. So I love that. I don't know, as an English teacher, I feel really proud of that story because the sensory language was really beautiful and all of these other things. But more than that, it's the feeling that you get when you share it. And I think that's where the power of storytelling really comes into it. And interestingly, when we share stories, what it does as an audience member is it wakes up the same neural pathways as what the speaker has when they're sharing the story. So it's literally like those mirror neurons fire, which is where that engagement comes from. Because my curiosity has always been like, why is storytelling so powerful? Because we could stand in front of a room, and I mean, Wil, you can speak to this. You literally run conferences all over Australia with thousands of young people in the audience. But some of your speakers could stand on stage and be like, oh, hi, my name's Wil, and today we're going to learn about resilience. And the 3 things you need to know about resilience are and you have young people just tune out completely.
Immediately.
Right?
Yeah, 100%.
Immediately. So when we tell stories instead, that's where that engagement gets built, because those mirror neurons begin to fire in our audience and they're on that journey with the speaker.
And I think it's an opportunity to find that common ground. We've spoken about it in previous episodes. It's also an opportunity to build depth to who you are and credibility as a person. And then it's in their moments that Amanda was just saying, I felt out of my depth. It's like they think about a moment that they felt out of their depth.
Yes.
And that's what they remember. Then as they're so engaged, you can take lessons away from it as well.
Exactly. So it's like relatability I'm hearing you talk about, which is really that common ground piece, which I know we've spoken about on the podcast before. Like it's where we're building connection with people through storytelling. So what does that look like in the classroom? Like, what does that actually look like? If I'm teaching English, I feel like it's an easy go-to for me, and it's easy when we're teaching texts that have stories and characters and history and all those kind of things.
Yep.
Maybe more challenging when we're in a science classroom or in a math classroom or whatever it is. Do either of you have any suggestions or tips for how we do storytelling in those spaces?
Well, I feel like one of the reasons, and you've touched on it, that those mirror neurons and that mirroring, there's a real connection there. And I think another reason that storytelling is so powerful in learning is because we know how our brain works, is that we don't comprehend something if we can't picture it. So every time we are listening to information or we're reading information, our brain is simultaneously painting a picture.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it is through that picture that we comprehend what we're reading or what we're listening to. And so what storytelling does so beautifully is paint a picture. And, if at any point, whether it's science, whether it's numeracy, I know for me personally, I'm a big math and science fan. I love...
You might not know this, Wil, but Amanda's actually said that if she hadn't studied teaching, she was going to do engineering, but would have done just a straight mathematics degree. That's how much she loves maths.
I really like numbers. I know. Well, you're shocked.
No, I'm not. But I do have a good example for numbers. How many of you remember the questions in the math of Barry has 14 watermelons?
Yeah.
He sells 2. What do you picture straight away?
Watermelons.
Someone trying to carry 14 watermelons.
I picture what Barry might look like, but that's just...
Right, because we picture
I'm
based
like,
on
where's Barry?
But as well, it's like even when we look at those numbers, the numbers and that rote knowledge of numbers isn't actually understanding of numbers. You
It's
know?
attached to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when we can take those numbers and apply that to our actual understanding of, you know, picturing 14 watermelons, 2 watermelons, that means that we can understand and relate what those numbers mean and then manipulate those numbers in our brain, and it makes sense for us. So I think eliciting the image is why storytelling is so powerful for learning. It's
it's
going on a
painting the
journey
picture.
together. Exactly.
And leaving like a little bit of autonomy as well for their imagination, because where did you imagine the watermelons?
I imagined a stack in a fruit shop. What did you imagine?
I imagined them in a trolley.
What did you imagine?
I imagined him balancing them all in his arms on top of each other and trying to carry them.
There we go.
Yeah.
And similarly, if we all imagine for a moment an elephant, and that elephant is wearing a polka dot hat and also a long red skirt, and that elephant is riding a unicycle and attempting to make it in a very narrow path across a lake. On a narrow wooden path across a lake on the unicycle. We're all picturing it
Yeah.
because we have to picture it to comprehend it. And that's, you know, as I think this is a big lesson as well as educators or anyone imparting any knowledge or sharing anything with anyone, is that if there's confusion from the people we're sharing with, chances are they can't picture it. They can't picture what we're saying. So how do we go back and paint a clearer picture?
And I think too, as an educator, this is something I probably learned way too late in my teaching career. But stuff like when you would pose a question to the class, like we all get taught about wait time, that like the amount of time you give students to kind of think about a question before it feels like way longer for the teacher than what it does for students.
oh my gosh, sometimes it feels like ages.
like
and you're like,
ages.
am I wasting time? I have
All of those
38 minutes
things.
left.
Yeah. But it's like what I actually learned later in my career is that if I asked a question and I didn't get any responses from students, is chances are exactly what you're saying, Amanda. They can't picture it. So they can't, in their brain, there's no association. There's no kind of like recall to anything that they've experienced. And I'm just thinking about like, what I used to love, I went to school in Queensland, so I was very lucky to be able to do marine biology as a subject. And
Amazing.
I know
I've
Will's
really
like,
learnt so
sorry?
much. So we have engineering and marine biology.
So got to study marine biology, which was awesome. But our teacher, he had such an amazing way of, even if it wasn't like a story about the specific skill, but he would like future pace it or paint a picture of where this might be useful in like, you know, down the track, like in life. So it would never just be like, oh, the boat's traveling at this fast. He'd be like, all right, so we live here. And what we know is that there's this island, and he'd pull up a map and we'd be like, okay, well I grew up in Harvey Bay and the island is Fraser Island or Gari. And he'd be like, and there's Gari. And you'd actually have this picture in your head when you're applying these concepts. It doesn't have to be this big mystical thing. And it's the same, I think, in science and maths. The more that we can produce those images, the more engaged our students are going to be.
And so I think what's important to touch on here is, I feel like when we talk about storytelling, we've all been there at times when someone has been telling a story. That there's different vibes with storytelling, right? So all of us have experienced someone telling a story just for the sake of telling a story because they want to feel significant. And we're like sitting there and we're like, sorry, where is this guy? Sorry, what's the, sorry.
It's like that friend when you're out for like, this sounds terrible, but you're at a dinner party or you're out for brunch or whatever it is, and someone tells a story, and before they've even like finished that point, someone else is jumping in going, oh, the time that I did this, or
Story toppers. Oh.
It's like, but it is right. That story topping thing totally comes from a place of needing to feel significant.
And also for everyone listening who is a teacher, we can all picture that student who does this as well, right? But so I guess being aware of where our storytelling is coming from, what place it's coming from. Is it coming from a place of significance, or is it coming from a place of contribution?
Yeah.
And I feel like in spaces where we are sharing, where we're encouraging, critical thinking, creative thinking, whether it's classrooms or in the community, coming from a place of contribution. So it's kind of like our story is a gift, and you're getting a learning from it or a piece of understanding from it is where the power comes. And that's also what's most engaging for our audience as well.
And I think that's like a journey as well, being self-aware of like, when you are stepping on someone else's story or someone else's toes just for your own sake. And I think like for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been very much more aware of it, because I know for me as a young person, I've been exposed to a lot more than what most other young people my age have been exposed to. So that when someone tells a story, there is often something in my mind is like, this relates to that. And it's like having the decision to just be aware that's not going to contribute anything to any conversation.
Yeah.
Totally.
But then I also, I say that, and then I also want to say as well, like, it's also okay sometimes, like that doesn't mean I go home at the end of my long day and sit on the couch with my husband and like not tell about my day because I don't,
not.
you know, it's
Yeah.
like there's
There's that
elements of that
balance
which are
like context is
Yes.
really important, and the relationship part of it is important.
Yeah.
And what we share with our students and the stories that we share with them are going to be very different to the stories that we share socially because of what's
Exactly.
appropriate.
Exactly.
And I think that's probably a really nice way to kind of make sure that the stories that we are telling are age and stage appropriate, and knowing that it's okay to leave out certain details and still make a point for the sake of learning or whatever it might be if they're not.
And if it's not as fun, be a little bit more dramatic.
Just embellish it a little bit. Just put a bit of salt and pepper on it, you
And
know?
I think like I know I need to start doing this, because there's so many times where things did happen that are like almost shaping a mind or
Yeah.
like a moment that really means something, and writing them down because I forget about them.
Yeah.
And then like it's a really good point for a story that I'm about to tell. And an example that I like to use is I had to deliver a keynote at a school, and it was based on showing up and owning your story. And on that same day, the story that I used was, on that day, I got into an Uber, and often I don't sit in the front of Ubers because I'm in an Uber about 4 times a day.
because FYI for everyone, Will doesn't have a car yet.
I don't have a car, and I also it's to the airport and back consistently. Yeah, I'll have 4 Ubers today from home to back to the story. But I got in the front this day, and he just wanted to talk, and I just wanted to work. But it got to a point where he turned to me and said, "If 7 billion people tell you you're a tree, are you a tree?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not a tree." He said, "But 7 billion people tell you." And then he goes in and he's like, "Well, if everyone else is telling you a tree, if society tells you to be something or do something, why don't you just be yourself?" But I then use that story and the same visual language to then deliver that point of owning your story on stage 3 to 4 hours later. So it can be them small moments or the big moments. And if you're teaching science, maybe you're learning about air pressure, and you've been on a hike one day where the air pressure has changed.
Yeah.
Or airplanes.
Yeah.
And I think maybe a good point there, or maybe a handy tip, is like keeping a bit of a story bank, like going in your phone, or, you know, things that happen. Because I'm always like, I'm sure there's a million stories, right? The link to a million things. But when someone goes, "Oh, tell me a story about this area or whatever," it's like, oh, you're like racking your brain.
What happened before?
Whereas
I was
we
like, I don't remember my childhood. And Amanda's like, "You've told me so many stories." I was like, "Oh, yes, good point."
So keeping a bit of a story bank is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
Amanda, I feel like you didn't finish your story as well, from
Well,
the start.
yeah.
I kind of cut you off.
No, we just got so much into storytelling, and so I guess it takes me back to that moment, sitting on that escarpment and looking at the stars and listening to the story from that traditional owner and the moral lesson, and then, you know, what happened next was so curious because I was just so present and like awake to this moment of like, hold this memory, like capture every moment of this memory, like this is so powerful. And then what happened is one of my students, her name is Stella, she turned to me once that story had ended and she said, "Amanda, it's your turn, like you tell us a story." And all these heads just turn and look at me. And I was like, what story could I possibly tell that is worthy of this moment? Like I have no idea. And she could see confusion on my face, and she said, "You know, tell us one of your family stories. Like, what's one of the stories that your great-grandparents told your grandparents and your grandparents told your parents and your parents told you?"
Wow.
And wow, I was a little floored. And what she said next was interesting, you know, because I said, I'm not sure. And she said, "That's okay. Tell me about the artwork of your family. What is the artwork that your great-grandparents taught your grandparents taught your parents, and your parents taught you?" And, you know, I didn't know what to say. And so what I said was, is it okay if I tell you the story of how I got here? Because this is one of the best moments of my life. And so that's what I did. But, you know, it reminds me that sitting down and sharing and listening to each other, you know, not just generationally, but within our generations, you know, listening to our students, listening to our friends, there's so much power in that. And I'm not sure about either of you, but I know hearing stories, you know, they evoke so much emotion. At the end of the day, we do remember how we felt. Like when we walk out of a situation, we don't necessarily remember those words or those things, but we remember how we felt in that space and in that place and with those people. And I think we can so cultivate that with storytelling.
100%. Our brains literally love it. It's like brain candy. It's that dopamine release when we hear a story or we hear, like, I feel like I just got that listening to the conclusion of your story. It's like that dopamine hit of like, oh, there was the resolution I was looking for. There was that final missing piece to that unfinished story.
Which is important as well, making sure that you can close the story.
Yes, close the loop. But also doing that evoking curiosity piece and making sure that we are like, the more questions we can create in our students' minds and whoever it is that's listening to us as well, because of those mirror neurons, their brains are going to actively be engaged because they're searching for that resolution. They're searching for that dopamine hit of the ending.
And knowing that if 30 people are listening to our story, 30 people are painting a slightly different picture, and that's perfectly okay because that's right for them.
And so I guess it's a great challenge for our listeners, for teachers that are going out there this week and they're like, what can I do to level up my teaching, or what's one thing I can add in to make it also more fun for me?
Yes.
Add in a story. Challenge yourself. Like, where can you build some stories into what can otherwise be really dry curriculum? As we know, it's going to be better for you and it's going to be better for the young people that are in your worlds.
Absolutely. Share stories, friends.
If not share a story, start building your story bank.
Yes,
Love
do that.
Thanks
you
for tuning
have
in,
been
everyone.
listening to Podclass, and we'll see you again soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
I'll be here for you, 'cause
You're there for them too.